of course, there are these times dedicated to oraison, as we say, to the time, our time of in silent prayer daily. But these are not, for him, very clearly not an end in itself. These are times to allow us to readjust ourselves, but in order then to live it, it's a life of prayer. And everything becomes fuel for our prayer.
To actually touch the fire that is God, and you can't, when you touch that fire, you will always draw some down, even if you feel dry and sleepy and poor. You can't help but be affected by it. Welcome to another episode of CarmelCast. CarmelCast is a production of the Institute of Carmelite Studies Publications. To get more info, you can find us on the web at icspublications.org. The final episode of the season is going to be a Q&A session. So this is a chance to get your questions on Carmel, on Carmelite spirituality. We want to really hear what you're asking. So please leave a question perhaps in the comments section, or click, if you're watching on YouTube, or click on the link below to fill out the form or to be able to submit your question, so that we can then get some of these questions and then answer them as our final episode for this season of CarmelCast. So today we have the great joy of having with us Anne-Elisabeth Giuliani, who is a member of the Secular Institute Notre Dame de Vie, and who's with us to speak about their founder, who is also a Discalced Carmelite friar, Blessed Marie-Eugene of the Child Jesus. So welcome again, Anne-Elisabeth. And you were on before. You were on one of our other seasons talking about what is a secular institute in this. It's a Carmelite secular institute that's associated with the Order of Discalced Carmelites. So maybe, though, for those who haven't seen the whole episode, you could just share a little bit about yourself and, your role in Notre Dame de Vie.
So thank you for having me. I'm very intimidated to have to speak about Father Marie-Eugene, because I feel very unworthy of his holiness. But he founded, indeed, a secular institute, which means it's an institute of consecrated life lived in the world, within the world, which makes me love the word secular that has such bad press these days. In secula seculorum. So in the world, and he believed, and I think we're going to see that today, very much that the energy, the dynamism of the Carmelite vocation, the Carmelite charism, could be lived by lay people, could be shared and lived in the midst of a very active life. He was himself quite an active man, actually. And he believed so much in those treasures of the spirituality of the Carmelite saints and their pertinence for today, that for him, when he met three women who were also young women in the 30s, in the 30s, who were in the late 20s, who were looking for their vocations and felt attracted to Carmel, but almost rejected by the Carmelites, nuns, he understood that was the moment for him. He had always felt, since his very first years as a Carmelite friar, a Carmelite priest, after his novitiate, that he felt some of the restrictions that were almost put on his being a monk, a friar. And he said, I dream of our order having little helps, he would say at the time, being able to go everywhere where we friars cannot go, and penetrate all the areas of the secular world and bring that stream of life that the Carmelite spirituality is and gives access to.
Yes. And if I could just, give my own testimony for a moment, that it was, for me as a diocesan priest, which I was before, it was meeting Anne-Elisabeth and Notre Dame de Vie, and really through reading Father Marie-Eugene and then discovering, wow, there's actually a member of his institute who's here in Washington where I lived, And it was through meeting Anne-Elisabeth that I came to understand the riches of Carmel in a much deeper way. And then eventually it was more awakened to my own vocation to become a Carmelite friar. It just shows how I guess you could say the purity of the Carmelite charism that is so alive in Father Marie-Eugene and in his children in Notre Dame de Vie, and how that continues to pass on into the world in a hidden way, perhaps. Not everyone knows about them, but so powerfully, and that has such an impact. So yeah, I'm very grateful for you and for Notre Dame de Vie to help me personally understand Carmel.
Thank you. It's mutual.
Definitely. Well, it's a great moment, to talk about Blessed Marie-Eugene. He's one of our newest Carmelite blesseds. He was beatified in 2016. And, we always joke that it tends to be the women in Carmel that get the most attention. They're the ones who are saints, our mystical writers, our doctors. Of course, we have St. John of the Cross, but other than him, there's not a lot of the men that represent in a similar way, that I guess the official canonization and the official, recognition of sanctity. But Blessed Marie-Eugene is one of them. And so he's just being raised up by the church, you could say, for our time as a spiritual teacher and as someone who has so much to offer for the church and for Carmel. But maybe I could just ask you, in a nutshell, if you could say, who is Blessed Marie-Eugene and what is his mission?
I think his mission, he said it himself, and so I'm not going to make any interpretation. He said that he had a very strong sense of his vocation being to lead other people to God, to the mystery of God, the heart of God. For him, God, it's almost, the word seems so flat today. But when he would say Dieu, it was that's the ultimate reality and the power of the love of the Spirit of God, and so leading people to God. The way I think he has felt himself led by the Spirit, but through this particular spirituality. And sharing that with the world, which in itself is very Carmelite, because isn't it what our Holy Mother Teresa, Holy Father John, Therese, little Therese are doing?
Yes.
Opening up for us ways to climb the Mount of Carmel. Yeah.
Well, and by mentioning that, I would say you could say even on a more original level or primitive level, the prophet Elijah does to stand before the living God, and that was his whole life, and his whole mission was to live in the presence of the living God and to bring that presence to others and to witness to that presence. And it seems like Father Marie-Eugene really had that Elijah, that original, almost you could say, Elijah spirit so alive in him.
Thank you for saying this, because I think for him, of course, he was definitely a son of the Reformed Carmel and of Teresa of Avila, no doubt. But he really liked and emphasized the Elijah nature, origin of our spirituality. And standing in front of the living God, allowing the living God to seize us, and to seize us in the very intimate way. That's the contemplative aspect of Carmel. But for the world, never for ourselves, always sending the prophets back to the weirdest, most complicated missions one can imagine. So that's really, I think that's really the synthesis of who he was. He died. One of his very, very last words were to the members of Notre Dame de Vie was a call to our faithfulness. So it's to the order, and so Carmel, and to what is essential. Understanding very well, he was a man who understood changes. He lived through so many changes himself in his life. I think that's a very important aspect. Maybe we can develop that later. But to what is essential. Yes. And what is essential? Contemplation and action together. Being one, united. Yes. And so he found that in Elijah. Of course, he found it also in certainly Teresa of Avila. He loved to show how active also she was. But for him, the reference to Elijah is absolutely essential, I think, to understand him.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. And I like how you mentioned that action and contemplation as one. It's not like we contemplate and then we go out and act, but it's the same reality. It's the same living God that we're uniting ourselves to.
Yes. He didn't like it too much when he heard people say, "Oh, I contemplate and then I bring to the world the fruits of what I have contemplating." So no. It's one reality, and
Oh, it's beautiful. And we could continue
so,
to unpack that. And I think maybe just to go a little bit into his biography, because he has a very fascinating story. And he's not so far from us, right? He was born in
94.
94. You should be the ones. I have the dates here. I know him very well, but I'm bad with dates, I have to say. But born in 1894, and he died in 1967. So somewhat contemporary in a sense. And he lived through, a lot. You think of all that happened during that time period. And he was right in the heart of it. He's in France and Rome during those times. So we'll get into that. But maybe just to share a little bit about how he grew up, his family,
Yes.
and maybe his early vocation call.
Yes, I like to think of him as a very sensitive child, probably a little shy, but very lively at the same time. But a very sensitive child, already from a young age, ready to respond. On the ready. And so he lived, he said, I was needed, like you need bread, needed, in love in my family. But it was a very poor, the circumstances were very poor, not unlike St. John of the Cross, actually. A little less stark, but so his father had there were so many wars. Let's not get into that. But his father ended up having to work in the mining industry of the southwest of France, which was very difficult and very dangerous. And yet he was he had worked as a nurse in the army at some point. I mean, he did that for the family to survive. His mother had decided to open, she probably was a good cook, I don't know, I've never heard about that, but she opened a little cafe in the house where she would prepare lunch and offer coffee for, the workers in the... So they were very hard workers, but they managed with 5 children to, to give them a decent life. And his father died very abruptly from pneumonia, I think, caught up in the summer very, very abruptly, and that was life became even harder. Yeah. And his mother worked very, very hard. She was doing laundry for other people. I mean, she was a hard worker. And actually, in the Constitutions of Notre-Dame-de-Vie, in the chapter of poverty, because we're in the world, so we do not live poverty as it would be lived in a convent or even in a religious life. I mean, but so the model he gave us is the mother of a large family who keeps for herself what she needs to have the strength to tend to her responsibilities as a mother. And that's the criteria. Yeah. So he was very impressed by that. So a lot of hardship, but a lot of love and a lot of, very Catholic surroundings in the culture, a very lively, I think, culture in the Southwest where he was. He says that when he was 9, he felt probably the first desire to become a priest. The priesthood is also another key to understanding him. And he says, I would go up in the village by the parish hall, by the rectory, and I would sit on a wall, on the top of a wall, a fence, and I would look at the church and the rectory, and I knew I wanted to be a priest, but he didn't know how. It was very expensive at the time. His mother had no money, and so he had spoken of this desire to the parish priest, but he so wanted it. So he was not even 11. And, congregations, religious congregations would go from village to village and try to find...
Kind of recruit.
Recruiting missions. So there was the Fathers of the Holy Spirit, who most of the religious congregation at that time in France had left France. They had to, because of the political situation, very complex relationship, especially with Catholic schools, very aftermath of the French Revolution, very complex situation in the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. So those congregations were outside of the country. And that was the first way that presented to him to have free access to becoming a priest, to the studies, So at not even 11, he begged his mother to let him go, which was, of course, very difficult. But there is an episode, and for me, I see it in several other places of his life, and it shows, again, this readiness to answer the prompting. So those friars, the spirit,
like
the Spiritan,
apostolic order, right?
Very missionaries, the missionaries of the Holy Spirit.
Yes.
And they were based in Italy, not too far from France, but still, no plane. And so it was arranged that he would go and he would have free tuition, free boarding, etc. And one of the priests was supposed to come and pick him up at the train station, and his mother had prepared a little suitcase, for him. And the priest didn't show up. There was no priest, but he jumped on the train.
Wow.
And he left his mother for his calling. And I think it's huge for, he was barely 11. I don't even think he was 11.
Mm-hmm. To go to a different country.
A different country with people he didn't know. And I mean, the priest was not there.
Yeah, the priest didn't even come.
So I don't know where maybe he was in another car in the train. I don't know, another coach. But the priest was not there. But he knew that train would take him where he had to go.
Yeah, he had to get on the train.
He had to get on the train.
This.
And he would do it. And for me, that's very much, it captures something about him. Yeah. Is that we leave behind and we go to, we don't calculate. He was a very wise, this being said, in government, as we know, and in so many things, he was very wise. Not that he was doing stupid, impulsive.
Yes,
it's not about it. But,
exactly.
but this readiness to leave behind ways of doing, cultures. And for 3 years, he didn't see his mother. He was so close to his mother and to his younger sisters. And just one letter a month or things like that.
Yes.
And so it was very hard. And he didn't feel that group was for him.
Well, that's the thing. It's interesting, looking at that. It was, I think, very providential in a way that he chose them, even though, he knew it wasn't for him in the end, but it was the Holy Spirit. So it's interesting, at the very beginning, the Holy Spirit was marked his spiritual life, his life of piety, probably. I'm sure they were doing many devotions and prayers. And so in a time, you could say, in the church when it wasn't, the Holy Spirit maybe didn't always have the most prominent, explicit role, perhaps, in spirituality. He already kind of was on the cutting edge, so to speak, at least, preparing him for his relationship with the Holy Spirit, which became like the defining relationship of his life.
Absolutely.
You could say. And one other thing too, I always thought was kind of nice, that Holy Spirit and Our Lady, and how he made his first steps in a Marian shrine. That was so when he was 1 year old or whatever.
That's right.
That's where he walked for the first time. So just you can see these marks of his eventual spirituality already, early on, and how God's providence was forging these things. As you said, for a child to be able to make that kind of decision, it just shows there was something in him, a strength that, of course, was aided by grace, to be able to live this way. And you see that unfold throughout his whole life. But as you mentioned, so he didn't eventually feel called to them. So, but he met a friend, right? There was a very special friend that he met, who was a recently deceased nun, who they had published her book, but it was before she was canonized or anything like that. And could you maybe share a bit about how he met this friend?
1908. He was, I think, 14. Yeah, he may have been in France already. And there was a young woman who had died in Normandy unknown in a cloistered Carmelite convent in the name of Therese of the Child Jesus, and little books had been published, shared by her blood sisters in Carmel, the Carmel of Lisieux, and a very tiny little book that he had that he saw. I don't know how he got to this book, but this book found him apparently, and he was immediately, he felt the reality of the presence of Therese and a mutual understanding, even though it was very basic, and we know how deeply he has then studied Therese and understood her, actually, to the point where Céline, one of Therese's blood sister, who met Father Marie-Eugene often later on when he was a Carmelite father, and he visited Lisieux on many circumstances. She said that she had never met someone who was so resembling Therese.
Yeah.
And yet on the outside it was very different. This strong man who had been, fought in 2 world wars, and
Right.
and little Therese. So, but she could see the relation, the resemblance,
Yes.
the kinship, the deep understanding of those two children of God.
Yeah, I can't think of a better compliment. I think I could live the rest of my life happy if someone.
I don't know if she told him, but she told people.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
But no, and that was such a defining moment for him to really come to embrace Therese in a little way, and how that would eventually bear a lot of fruit in terms of his own discernment to Carmel as well. But so he eventually decides that this congregation is not for him, and it was complicated too, because again they were the ones sponsoring him and everything. But he has to follow that. He can't just go to a place because it's free. But he knew he didn't feel that draw. So he ended up getting permission and went into the diocesan seminary.
First, the little seminary, and it was, again, his mother had to work very hard. She wanted him to work, but she yielded to that calling, also. And every week or every month, she had to give him I don't know how many francs for his board
Tuition.
and for his tuition there. And he said this money, he knew the cost of the price, and how much it had cost her to work so hard for him to go and to study instead of helping. And so he said that this money was burning my hands when I was receiving it. So he was very aware that a vocation entails the sacrifices of many other people, that it's almost a family and the effort of a village,
Right.
It takes,
Yes. Well, so then he goes to the minor seminary. He does very well. I mean, he's very gifted intellectually, we know, and he has it seems like he just had a great memory. It's one thing always struck me about him. Eventually, when he would, give talks, and he very rarely used notes, right? And so he just had this grasp of spirituality, theology that was precocious, maybe you could say, for his age. And then he goes into the major seminary, just begins, and then this unfortunate event breaks out, World War I, which changed everything.
Changed everything for him and everything for the world, truly. And everything for the church also in the West. I think that's something maybe that underappreciated. So he even anticipated. He volunteered, like so many young men, to go, because he loved his country, and they thought it would be a short kind of thing. So in any case, off he went, and he found himself in the most horrific circumstances. This World War I has been a trauma, I think, in Europe, that we're still feeling the consequences of it. And millions of young men died. And life was never the same after that. it's certainly when the period between the two world wars were very rich for the church, to be sure. There was sort of a renewal, certainly in the order of Carmel. But also that's when we begin to see a sort of dismantlement of this Christian fabric. That's what war does. I think we're not maybe aware enough here that what war does.
Yes.
It destroys really the heart, and it destroys the human heart. And so that's when the absurd, we tend to think here, oh, it's the 60s, but it really started way before. And then, yes.
Yes, like that sense of the absurdity of existence and the meaning that there's no intrinsic meaning. When you're in that that kind of evil, it just strips you of maybe convictions, even the deepest convictions or values that you might have.
Yes.
And no, you're right. We do underestimate that and the damage that causes.
The violence, and the stress that it provokes also. We were not at the time talking about, post-traumatic syndrome and all of this, but it existed nonetheless, and it destroyed so much. So much.
Because you think, too, the families, the poor mothers who lost their, sometimes several sons, it just it affected everyone. And you see it, I remember, going to France, every little town has their memorial to those who had fallen. Every parish, right? You see in all the parishes, these plaques, all those who had fallen. I mean, nothing like that had happened before.
No, to that magnitude, yes. And so... So he was a seminarian, and he really tried to remain a seminarian through all of that. He learned so much in that period. He would always have, stories to tell about the soldiers and life on the front, but I think very more interestingly, he, with his keen sense of observation, it was an exposition, for he was exposed to human nature in incredible ways.
Yes.
The soldiers, the guys always together, not always, and so he's seen it all.
Such different characters.
Different
face, yes.
Exactly, coming from all over. And so he learned a lot about human nature there, and about the human character, so he was really trying. He was apparently a very good leader of men because he rose fairly quickly.
Yes.
He was really trusted. The men loved to come to be in his unit because no one ever died under him. He had asked for the protection of Therese, and but he. There were lots of stories where he would really try to keep the morale of the people up, and he would try to keep. I also think that he gave him an experience of living the faith in, outside of a seminary, in the world.
Yes.
And I really think it gave him, when we think of him founding a secular institute also, I think he believed in that, in the testimony of just, being good with those soldiers in, trying to make sure that they have good food, trying to make sure that they have a good soccer game, trying to do, that was World War II more, but, trying to keep the morale, trying to, and giving a simple witness.
Yes.
He was, they would never have accepted to hear homilies from him, right? and good theology from a seminarian. No. So he understood that we could bear witness in the world just by being. By being
who you are.
A Christian, of course, but by being, and not just talking. So I think this World War I has been formative at so many levels for him.
And I love, he said that he would still, early on he had to make a decision too. He was a seminarian, and a lot of seminarians went into the war, right? And then many didn't go back to seminary. And they kind of, not necessarily that they lost the faith, but whatever it was that was driving them to the priesthood, by the end, whatever happened. But he made sure he did his prayer every day, and at kind of great cost in a way, because people did look at him and think that's weird, But he was who he was, and people, like you said, respected him. And then as they saw how kind he was. But one story I have to just share, because it's one of my favorites, is that not everyone loved him. Let's say he's he's strong, and he knew it was right. And so certain people maybe were rubbed the wrong way. And there was one who was probably an unstable character in his unit who he disliked him so much that he even told one of his fellow soldiers, if I get into a foxhole with him and there's a chance, I'm going to take his life. And so this soldier went and told Father Marie-Eugene. And so, a couple days later, battle flares up. Marie-Eugene goes straight into that man's foxhole. And he says, here's your chance. Here's your chance. And the guy was so flabbergasted by this boldness, he didn't know what to do. He ended up requesting a transfer and leaving the unit, So, but that just says something about his character too, I think,
Yes, very bold.
Yes. But,
yes.
So then the war, thank God, eventually ends. He's, has a great promise of a military career because he did so well and he was so respected as a leader. But he made a very clear decision. And not that he wasn't moved, and he had befriended a family, right? There was a couple daughters that he was close to of this family around his age, and there was a lot of prospects. Maybe he could, and it was a nice family. I mean, it would be a move up in society for him. But then I guess the story that I heard is he came, they had some festival or something in the town, and he showed up in his cassock. And that was kind of the sign, like, all right, I'm going back. I'm going back.
Yes. I chose the priesthood. Through and through. Mm-hmm. Yes, entirely, completely.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And so he knew. So he went back to major seminary, a different person, though, right? He wasn't the same as when he left.
Yes. No, he wasn't the same. And I think, again, something happened to him that happened along his life. And I think, as a historian, trained a little bit myself, I would love to see someone dig into that. Because there is some sort of a pattern, and certainly very often this man who seems to be very articulate, who knew how to lead people, how to organize, how to build, how to take risks, and how to be prudent at the same time, accomplished in many ways, oftentimes felt he was a misfit, I think. I really think so. And it's not that I think. We have the sign, he says it, but when I say I think, it's because I think it has not been studied very much yet, unpacked. But in this seminary, he was, his generation was with very young men who had been too young to go to the front. And again, in that post-World War I era, the Catholic Church became very overly protecting of people, because it was so easy to lose the faith at this time, and so those young men, he felt them. He says that it was stifling for him. And he said, where is the freedom that I used to see in the seminary? Yes. Maybe a little bit, they were almost, not afraid of everything, but it was very, not that his time had been, at the time, seminary was very regimented, and life was much more disciplined.
Like a monastery.
Life was anyway much more disciplined in general than it is now. So that's not that, but it's the spirit. The spirit, yes. The spirit had become a little bit, to use a word of self-referential. Yes. A little timid. Yes. And we're going to do this to protect ourselves, and he was very ill at ease in that. And yet he continued. I think it was, they had seen so much, those young men,
Yes.
And they were ready to, they were ready.
Yes, yes.
They were ready. And for the apostolate, actually.
Yes. Yes.
And so there is that. And then we see also him in his at Carmel during his novitiate, a few things also where you feel he loved it. I mean, but in terms of human relationship, I think he's at the level of human relationships. I think there is something about him that would be needed. Maybe that's you, the Carmelite friars, who are going to do it one day. Also, how he was with his brothers. I mean, we can see that. Maybe as we move along, we can see that. But it's more and more. It strikes me as when I read about him, I said, "Oh, look what he says." I mean, he really. It was hard for him. We think that it was okay, but in fact, he was, at some level, he was a little bit always ahead of his time.
Well, that's it. It's kind of like you're going back to something. I think of like St. Ignatius when he had to go learn Latin, and he's with like, all these like 14-year-olds, and he's already been like a soldier and had this big conversion. And, but it's like you're trying to fit yourself into something that God has already done so much in you. You've expanded so much. And then to try to like fit into this mold that was even more, there was more of a stricture in a way after the war, like you said. And maybe that's part of it. I'd never thought of this before. Maybe that was kind of training ground, or just kind of like the fallowing ground for him eventually for this vocation of Carmel. And because he had never heard of Carmel, he didn't. I mean, he had heard of Carmel, perhaps the saints, but he didn't know any friars. Let's say he'd never met a friar.
There was no friar in France.
There was no friar in France. Exactly.
They had all gone. There had been there were no religious left.
That's right, because of the laws of 1901 or whatever it was, right? And so he. But then, during this time in major seminary, he goes to meet the nuns. The nuns were still there, and he became very close with one of the nuns. And by the way, I don't even know if we said he was born Henri Garalou. Henry. Sorry. Henry. So he wasn't Marie-Eugene until later, just to say anyone's wondering. Henri. So I'll let you do the French pronunciation. I think that's probably for the best. So he eventually meets this Carmel, through the Turn sister especially, and I forget, he would go there sometimes, and it just he felt an instant rapport with them, and they gave him a little book on St. John of the Cross, right? And he said the book, looking back on it, it wasn't maybe the best quality or the most, but it was something. It was a description of his life and his spirit, and so then can you say he takes it back with him. He wasn't even planning on reading it, right? He just wanted to be polite.
He was but he took it. He had it, and so he took it on his retreat before one of the minor orders that they had to go through.
That's right.
So and so he took it at this retreat, and it was like lightning for him. He was struck, and he knew he had to become a Carmelite friar.
It's
but
amazing.
He didn't know exactly what. He had never seen any,
and what that's going to mean, but he just knew he had to do it.
And again, it goes back to his initial vocation. He responds.
Yes.
There is an opening, because he knew fear. It's not someone who didn't know. He was a human person, but there's a quality about. I think it's both human and supernatural about his personal faith, the quality that allowed him to just jump. And again, to leave, and he loved Abraham so much. He felt also. So I think that this movement, leave your country, leave and just be open to what. But in order to be open to what is coming, you have to be open now. Because if you're not open now, you cannot hear the call. So it says something, I think, very deep about him, very characteristic, I think, of him.
Yes, and he lived his whole life that way. I mean, like you said, from when he was a kid. So that was who he was, and thank God, because he just responded to the Spirit. Like you said, he just and every time God was asking him something, and sometimes it seemed so hard. And this in a way was probably the hardest. In certain ways, because of what it would mean for his family, because it was not in their plans that he would become a Carmelite. Like especially his mom, right? She had worked so hard to support him, and she had her dreams. We forget. Our family sometimes can get attached to their dreams for us, right? And that's hard to break from. I mean, because we feel so beholden to them. We're so dependent on, or grateful in a way too for what they've done for us. So she, it was her plan to live, with her son, to kind of be his housekeeper in a way. I mean, that was the thing that happened back then, the sister or the mom might live with the priest and kind of help and help be company too. Right. And then he had to tell them, I'm going to Carmel, and maybe you could just share some of that experience.
And he responded, but even when he was a child, and then he responded, but he consulted. I mean, again, it's not just an impulsivity kind of thing. So I think it's important to specify, but because for him consulting was very important, and that was the way of fully obeying and not so he would take, but
he had his spiritual director.
He has a spiritual, but it was hard for his family. It was very hard for his diocese. His bishop didn't want to lose him.
Yes.
And he had great, at that time in France, still, there were still many priests still. It's becoming of the decline, but it's still. And so many dioceses were sending priests to the mission, to the missions. And they felt that he had the temperament for that. That he could really serve, and both in the diocese but also elsewhere. And he was, one of the special...
like a little mission team almost that they're going to...
Mission team, and also, he had, qualities also for, playing an important role in the diocese. So the bishop was not happy either. So there was a lot of opposition. And then... there was also, because, people are not just opposed just out of interest. Of course, his mother would have loved him to stay and the bishop would have loved him to stay. But also, they could see that how much a man of action he was, how entrepreneurial he was, and so they said, why can't you pick at least another order? What are you going to do in Carmel? Well, it's for people, it's prayer and it's contemplation, and not that they doubted that he was, a spiritual person, but they could not see him with such constraints.
Yes. And it even happens today where people think, when they think Carmel, they think, okay, it means you're cloistered, and everything. And they don't realize too always that the friars do have a distinct, like they do have an intense contemplative life. It's a contemplative life, but it's lived in not in enclosure in the same way, let's say, as the nuns. But people don't always get that, so they think, oh, Carmel means, you're just going to lock yourself in the monastery. That's it, and how could you waste, look at all these gifts you have. And all that you've been given.
It's a waste of your gifts. Yes. And so all of this, of course, played. So there was a little dance with him, his spiritual director, the bishop. It lasted. He wanted to obey. And he said, if his spiritual director at first didn't want to hear about it, then told him to wait. And so he had decided that if his spiritual director would not mention it, it was done. And his spiritual director, out of the blue, apparently just,
brought it up.
And so, there were signs. It would be a long story to tell here, to say here. But so he was able to go. He wanted to leave as soon as possible. And he had never met a single Carmelite friar in his life. So imagine all the things we do today with vocations and the preparation and the this and the that, and we know them and blah, blah. And so he was supposed to arrive on February the 23rd, 1922, at the Carmel of Avon. His mother had really made a great crisis, actually, to hold him, and saying that she didn't think she would be able to survive that separation, etc. So it was very, very intense emotionally, and especially with her. But of course, the entire family is suspended on this relationship of the mother and the son. So it was very, very difficult. He had planned to make sure that she was okay, to spend the night at one place, to make sure that to learn, etc. So it was...
and not to mention, he'd just been ordained a priest, too.
He had just been ordained a priest.
I think February 4th, right, was his ordination day.
Which is now his feast day.
Which is now his feast day. I know, it's so beautiful. And so less than 3 weeks after his ordination, after everything, then he's going to the novitiate. So, it's like, imagine the intensity of all of that together, and like you said, with the
Yes,
family.
he would say, I don't know what they're doing. If they climb trees, if they sleep in trees, I will do that.
Yes, I love
but
that.
he knew that they were not eating meat.
Mm.
So when he arrived, he sat on a bench and he pulled out of his bag un saucisson. It's a cured meat, delicious cured meat that we have. And he ate his
Better than a Slim Jim, probably.
Oh, much better. and he ate it before ringing the bell. So he thought it would be the last time he would eat meat. He had no idea. So, yes. And he arrived, it was a day late. And the Carmelite friars were quite upset that he would arrive 24 hours late
I'd never heard that.
schedule. Yes,
oh, man.
yes. So he was not warmly welcome. So
that gives me comfort. Anyone who's late to things,
it's not always bad.
It's always bad.
I don't know why he was delayed on the road. I mean,
Sure.
But
So now Henri becomes a novice. He takes the name Marie-Eugene. After the nun,
Yes.
the mother priors. And now it's normal in France to have Marie as part of your name.
Yes.
For the men.
Yes,
for
the
so
men.
Marie,
and for have it first.
To have it
Here
first.
would be Eugene Marie, maybe.
Yes.
More of, yeah.
So he takes it, but it says a lot that he took it after, because that's where he, in some sense, right, in honoring that. And honoring his mom, he says, too.
Yes.
To take it after the mother priors, he honors his own mom. And then also taking on of the child Jesus,
Yes.
right, honoring Saint
Her mom
Therese.
was called Marie, yes.
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 Oh, the mom was Marie.
I believe so.
Yes, you're right.
I believe so. Marie Miral, I think.
Marie Michal.
Yes.
I have to stop trying to do French pronunciation. But yes, that's so yes, that it shows the honor that he's giving them. And he goes to the novitiate, and as you said, the Carmelites had just come back from France, because now by this point the laws had become a little more permissive. So the Carmelites come back, but they're unknown. A former provincial of the Carmelites, right, from not that long before, in the late 19th century, had apostatized and started his own church. That didn't give the Carmelites a great name. And Therese offered her last communion for this priest, right,
Yes.
Father Hyacinth Loyson. So Marie-Eugene, enters this Carmel that is not very known. And a lot of older friars, doesn't seem like it has a lot of maybe potential, but like you said, he wants to do it. And they emphasize, the emphasis at that moment too was a lot of asceticism,
Yes.
a lot of, you could say like looking to their past and using kind of the hagiography as a guide for how to live their life right now. So, which, of course, nothing wrong with using our saints, that we need our saints, but maybe in a way kind of overemphasizing perhaps some of like the more physical aspects of mortification and penance. And Marie-Eugene, he gave himself to that, right? He gave himself to it very generously.
Wholeheartedly.
Because he's like, this is what I'm here for. I came, I joined, I gave up everything. I'm giving myself to this. But he could tell it like there's something with his spirit. It didn't quite gel. That sort of approach. Carmel gelled. He loved everything about Carmel, but that approach to the ascetical life perhaps didn't quite, right? He felt constrained in a way, similar maybe to, you mentioned, the seminary. And then, so then things started to develop for him that kind of helped put him on a new path.
Yes. So he certainly gave himself wholeheartedly. I think the atmosphere was still very Jansenistic, and he spent, I would say, when we will talk about his spirituality, certainly a great deal of his preaching and of his life to try to address that. And it was a great obstacles that he discovered later on in the feminine Carmels that had difficulties welcoming Therese, actually. And this man, he had great understanding for them and respect, because he understood that their life had to be complete. They had to leave. And so he understood that following rules, external rules, had been for them the way to remain faithful, to hold on to what they had. But at the same time, he could see that this was not life-giving, and that something was that he could not. But he said, well, if that's really what it is. So he tried very hard to the point of, he would sleep on the floor. He would, all that with permissions. They would let him do that. Not only eating one day a meal and all of those things, and the penance with chains and everything. I don't even know what it looks like. Just looking at it terrifies me. So, but his spiritual director, novice master, would let him do that. And he thought he let him do that. But he was so ill at ease, as you said, that he asked to do a 10-day retreat. And the spiritual director said, but you just did a retreat for your profession. Why are you doing another retreat? But he gave him permission. And that's really where he saw, he began really journeying at the deeper interior level with Therese. She's not just, the one who keeps the bullets away, but she's really, or the sweet, gentle friend, but she's really the one that begins teaching him ever more deeply. And there was a little life of Therese with illustrated, with not a cartoon, but with little pictures. And there is one where you see Therese, who, just like him in the convent, she had tried to embrace all the very penitential. It was the spirit of reparation, to so many offenses had been done, of course, to the Lord in that period in Europe, in France in particular. And so people were giving themselves as an act of reparation. But it was, Therese saw through it very quickly, as he did, but he did through Therese. He understood that was not what could really quench the thirst of Jesus on the cross. That it was still so much our own, we were still offering, our pride was still in the way.
Yes.
And so he discovered that with Therese. There is a little picture where you see Therese going up the Mount of Carmel with all kinds of penance instruments, all kinds of things. And then in the middle she said, I can't, I'm giving it up. And she realizes in the little story that she's going to offer herself up to mercy, to the Lord who is mercy. Of course, the Lord who is mercy, we know that is a just Lord too. But so she completely freed him. And years later, he would say, he was not lax at all, but he was very suspicious when we were trying too hard to follow some rules of penance, asking for, additional penance or focusing so much on the externals of penance. He would say, that's not what penance is all about.
Yes.
Just go out and live your life. And then the young prophet at Notre Dame would come back, and a big thing had happened, a very big event in her life, much, much harder to take than all the efforts she would have done. And so that's, understanding that the Lord is the one who wants to purify us. And so, of course, we do the efforts that we need to do, but that's not that's not what gives us grace.
Yes. And you could say, it just hit me too, as in some ways, it's like, it's so much about what we're doing. Whereas Carmel and Marie-Eugene bringing this out so well, Therese, of course, all of our saints, but it's about what God is doing.
Yes.
Like that, it's God becomes the protagonist. He's the one who takes over our prayer.
The initiative. He
takes the initiative. And it's not just us planning on ways that we can repair and do these things. That's still, for some people, that's a necessary step perhaps to get to that, but God wants to take over. And if we get so focused on what we do, it can become a block in the end.
Yes. And later on he would say, so we're touching on the spirituality a little bit, he would say, I would never have felt the freedom to tell you that if I myself had not been to the end with the other method.
Yeah.
And so I can tell you from experience, don't go there. It's not worth it.
Yes.
I did it. I went through it. And I can tell you coming back from it, this is not the way.
Yes.
So in a way, that's what Therese had done also for him, because it's through her that he really understood that.
And so that, you could say, to use secular terminology, a watershed moment, for Father Marie-Eugene in the novitiate. He ends up making first profession, and he's seen that he has a lot of gifts, right? So he's put in charge of the editorial of Carmel, this journal they have, and right away he makes it flourish. He the people he gets to write for it, etc. But he feels this mission to give the spirituality. It's for him, right? He has this need to, like you said, to bring people to God. And so How did that unfold, in his life as a young friar?
I think he would approve your CarmelCast initiative. He would have done that too, because it transformed this little magazine, the Carmelite magazine, in one of the most respected at the time in France, at this time of this deep renewal of Catholic life, Catholic intellectual life, Catholic spirituality. And he was in the northeast of France, in Lille, which was a very lively center for Catholicism. There were several in France, but that was one of them. He befriended all the great philosophers of the time, included, of course, Jacques Maritain, and then he also, the theologians, etc. People who were also artists. And so I think he was sharing the Carmel, but at the same time he was receiving from this exchange. He was a very open-minded person. He was so clear about what was his goal, how he would go, about even the faithfulness to the essential of his being a Carmelite friar, no negotiation about that. But he was very, very open, and we can see that so many influences, exchanges of ideas, later on, but it's still in the same vein. He supported a lot Father Bruno de Jesus, I think, with the psychological studies around Carmel, interreligious dialogue. He they were one of the first ones, to have conversations with the Eastern religions and try to understand. So there was a great openness, understanding that it's part of his love of the world, I think, part of this, the mission, seeing it as how to first to form oneself, to understand the world, the realities, the different ways of seeing, of understanding, and also once understanding to be able then to give, to go to that world and in a way that makes sense, knowing how to find the ways to talk, to speak to the world. So he learned that. He did it as soon as he left Carmel, as soon as he left the novitiate. He was immediately immersed in this apostolate, very beautifully, very, and again, that was a very enriching time.
Yes, well, and
him.
It's amazing just looking at Carmel in France in general at that moment. You had the guys who would eventually become like the giants in a way of spirituality. You mentioned Bruno, who wrote a very, defining biography of St. John of the Cross. It kind of opened up, you could say, maybe a modern understanding of St. John of the Cross. And just to say, too, for Father Marie-Eugene, he always said, at the bottom of my soul, right, lives John of the Cross.
Yes.
So that was, but of course, Holy Mother St. Teresa, too, that she is the spiritual mother that he took on. St. Therese, his special friend, his teacher, he's the disciple of St. Therese. So he's just immersed in Carmel in dialogue, like you said, with all these intellectuals, with these other young Carmelites who are up and coming in a sense. So it's just it just seems like a very special graced moment at that time.
Historically, yes.
Yes.
For him, but also in general, yes. But at the same time, going back to the idea of being, seeing oneself a little bit as a misfit may not be the right word, but I have no other word that comes to me, is so in Carmel, they was with these old, very strict guys. But then with these very bright, very admired theologian philosophers who speak, he had a strong accent from the southwest of France. So he felt, I don't know if he was looked down upon, but he felt looked down upon because of this. He was self-conscious a little bit of he never lost it. And he was, at the time, Carmelites friars would not go to the university, would not get doctoral degrees out of humility and poverty and all of those things. So these guys were giants intellectually. He was, but with no credentials, so to speak. And so it always kept him, I think, also very humble, in a position of humility. But also, again, I think he could see the influence that one could have just by living out the Carmelite calling, the Carmelite spirit, the Carmelite charism, and but while being open, and in always
Well,
Yes.
in a sense too, as you say that, it just hits me that, I mean, that it's almost like that is part of the Carmelite charism, right? There's something so universal to Carmelite spirituality and to our tradition
Yes.
that lends itself to openness and for people to be able to recognize that truth, that absolute, thirst for God, who might be from very different walks of life. And so Carmel, if it's being who it is in a way,
Yes.
leads to that, you could say, to dialogue and to openness, because it's so universal. It's so what we need. We thirst for it without even realizing it often, I think.
That's right.
And so people like Marie-Eugene were raised up, I feel like, to help quench some of that thirst. I mean, this is sounding very poetic maybe, but to, to be able to offer it in a way that it wasn't maybe always seen. And so we could just share a little bit about then his work with meeting all these intellectuals. He started these courses on prayer that a lot of philosophers came to, right? And
yes, so when he was in the south of France,
yes,
and after he met the 3 members of Notre-Dame-de-Vie at the Petit Castelet, which was a convent where he had been sent by the order, even though he did not believe in the mission of that. He thought that Carmel was for mature men, and that these teenagers pretending to form them to become future Carmelites was a misconception. But he obeyed. He really he was vindicated, by the way, I mean, in his thinking, because not a single one of these young men, I believe, joined Carmel. So
it's like all that time and energy.
But they were well educated, which is great, and they probably kept this going.
Yes.
But so that's where he met the first members of Notre-Dame-de-Vie, and they had opened the first Catholic high school for women after World War I in the city of Marseille, this great port city on the Mediterranean. And they invited him to give courses about interior prayer, about Carmelite spirituality. And yes, a few philosophers from the school of Aix-en-Provence, as it was called, were coming. But also the very simple people, the staff from the school was also joining. And it was always a very mixed group of people. And one of the philosophers at the time told Father Marie-Eugene, because he was, again, I think, a little self-conscious. He loves to write very well. He had such a heightened sense of the beauty of the French language that he mastered beautifully in his writings. So he would write, And one day, one philosopher told him, you're so much better when you don't read, when it's come from your the depths of your heart, and they could not care less about, his accent. So he understood the lesson, he heard the lesson, and he would prepare, but he would read less.
Yes.
But yes, it's to show his responsiveness again. But from those conferences, those lectures, came out the book that his masterpiece called I Want to See God.
Yes, maybe that'll be a good moment. We'll just give a little preview here. You might have seen this before. This is actually, so these are the 2 volumes. I Want to See God, I'm a Doctor of the Church, but originally it was all combined into one. It's just for the sake, I think, of the length that they kept it. But it's it's those courses, the fruit of his own prayer. And I love it too, because what he does, he synthesizes our holy parents, right? And St. Teresa of Jesus for him is the model, the overall arching system. And then, of course, with St. John of the Cross, St. Therese. But it's his own experience, too. And I think that's what's unique about I Want to See God. So it's a practical synthesis, it says, of Carmelite spirituality. But it's not just an intellectual work. It's not just a work of someone who's, breaking down other people. No, he's giving his own experience, too. And it's really his heart that's in here. So I think if anyone wants to get to know Father Marie-Eugene better, and like you said, it's not easy reading, but it's also not too much. Like these are these staff at the school that were in these courses. It's not like he was trying to just hit some high level. So it does. Yeah, it just to say, and ICS Publications is coming out with a new translation, new edition of it, hopefully soon. But for now, it is available in print in another form.
Yes, yes. That's quite a book. So it is certainly comes from his own experience. He doesn't say I. I mean, it's a very it's an expose. I mean, but you recognize that it is coming from experience. It's not a dissertation where you just dissect things from, even if you haven't lived it, right? No, it's the fruit of his own experience. And I think that's why it speaks to the heart, because it can be, I mean, these realities are complex about the spiritual life, and, you know, the convergence of our psychologies, our souls, our intellect, all of this. It's very subtle and complex, but it's readable because it is coming from his experience, and therefore there is a life, something that burns you, you know, when you read it.
Yes, exactly. I like how you say that. There's something that burns you, and that's one of the, maybe you could say, the gifts of Marie-Eugene, is that his writings, it's sort of like what they say with Holy Mother. They said you know her through her writings. I mean, it's like you meet her, you know. And I think it's similar with Blessed Marie-Eugene.
I agree.
You know, and when you read it, you don't just meet this text that's like, oh, that's interesting, or that helps me. It's like it's almost like this living experience of God that you're delving into, and that kind of opens things up in your own life and guides you towards that.
It sheds light to our own experience. Yes.
Definitely.
So it reveals ourselves, actually, to ourselves. I think also those our Teresa, but also John of the Cross. It's a
really all of our Carmelite
all of
saints.
Our Carmelite saints.
You know, even though
Teresa is a little different, but
yeah,
in that sense, it's more because she's less systematic than the others.
Yes.
But
But even the ones who are systematic, it's for the sake of encounter with God. It's not just an intellectual exercise, and this is what happens, or this is how it's laid out. Or, but yeah, no, I think it's very important to point that out. And so then, could you now? You know, I know we're pushing our time, so I just want to mention maybe his work then with founding Notre Dame de Vie, and you could just share maybe about how that happened.
So we have a longer episode that we did about that, but very briefly, maybe we can say that it is coming from, again, his conviction, this guiding principle in his life that, first of all, that the Holy Spirit is guiding everything, but also this conviction that these treasures, these big, heavy books in the libraries, you know, that people can see, Teresa, John, and are for everyone, and that's that holiness is for everyone. In that sense, he was very much anticipating. He was so happy with the declaration of universal holiness from the Council, Vatican II. That deep conviction, which of course was also the conviction of of Teresa of Avila, that all could have access to that, and that interior prayer is the royal path to reach that. So that conviction, and seeing also, you know, seeing the soldiers, seeing the intellectuals responding, seeing those young women so thirsty for that, so ready for it, were confirmation that he needed to pursue that. It would be interesting also, again, to see how that was perceived by his brother in Carmel. Yeah. You know, and how all of that, I mean, to situate him, I really think we are only at the beginning to unpack his history, because it's so dense, as you see. I mean, so many lives in just one life. And so it's, so he trusted, but he felt, as much as he believed that Carmel could be lived in the world, he also believed that it needed, in order to be discovered and nurtured, to have those times in the desert, as we say in Carmel, in solitude. And so this property of Notre Dame de Vie was given to him at that time, given to the Carmel, but no other friar wanted to do anything. So he said, okay, I think I have an idea. Those women are not far away from that property. And that's where it all began. He also loved that property very much, because on it was a shrine dedicated of Mary, Mother of Life, that had been in existence since the 5th century. And so he felt very, very strongly the presence of Our Lady, which we haven't spoken about Our Lady, but of course, but she's always there. And I think he would say this of Carmel, and it's John of the Cross, I think, who says that the most Marian souls are not the ones who speak the most about Our Lady. But doesn't he say something? I don't know where it is, but he says something like that. It's not devotional. It's something deeper in
Yes.
Carmel. It's a call to
Well, it's your
this
living.
imitation. Yeah.
It's it's imitation. It's you're identifying yourself in a way with Mary's interior life, and you're trying to live that out and make that your whole path.
Your whole path. And there is a very deep Marian, identity, I think, in the way of living the secular, the life of a secular institute, consecrated laity, because you live. Mary was, she was not going about saying, "I'm the mother of the Lord. Look at me, please. Give me a good spot." And so there is something about the hidden life that is not lived in cloistered, but is lived really in the ordinariness of life. So that's where he saw that life could be very Carmelite, in fact, even in the world. And at the time, secular institutes were not recognized by the church yet. It did not exist as a possibility, but he believed in it. And so did many other groups throughout Europe after the shock, again, of World War I. The spirit really sprung in too many ways. I mean, there were groups of men and women who wanted to give themselves entirely to the church, entirely to the Lord, but felt called to remain involved in politics, in jobs, in order to transform the world from within. Different spiritualities, different styles. And so the church observed that. And it's Pope Pius XII who said, but there is really no theological impediment to live a life. It would be different, but you can live before it was historical or sociological impediments, but nothing to prevent it. And he felt that it was really a great richness that could be. Communism was also at the door of Europe, so it was important to be able to give a testimony without, to go where the church may be stifled. So it was declared. And what is very interesting is that in 47, it was recognized by. It was called Provida Mater. It was a exhortation. But the year after, Pius XII observed things, and he said, we're not asking you to be religious in the world, because then just be a religious in the world. That exists already, But you need to be lay people in the world, consecrated but lay. You remain lay people. And Father Marie-Eugene liked that. I mean, he understood that. That was his intuition. So that's naturally that we became, secular institutes. It could have been something else, but that was what the church was offering then, and it really matched his own intuition.
Yes. Well, and I would just say the thing I was probably struck by the most early on when I encountered Notre Dame de Vie and Father Marie-Eugene was that invitation to live the intensity of Carmelite prayer still. I think my experience with the Institute members has shown me that they live it, in a way. Well, I don't compare. Comparisons are odious, but one of our big staples in terms of our kind of concrete way of life is having 2 hours of quiet prayer each day, one in the morning, one in the evening as we can. And, when you're a nun, of course, it's built into your day. When you're a friar, too, it's built into your day. So there's a certain freedom. It's an ease in a way. You're doing it. But as Notre Dame de Vie, it's also, that was one of the paths for Notre Dame de Vie, to live those 2 hours of prayer, even though you're a doctor. I remember the one lady was an ambassador I met to, I forget which African country. Yourself working, but being that committed to contemplative prayer, I guess, in the midst of a very, demanding life, it just shows the power of being able to live Carmel in this way, and the commitment that is, that I think is heroic. All right, so we hear about this prophetic, beautiful experience of Notre Dame de Vie being founded. And from my understanding, too, it was one of the first of the secular institutes, right? So it was right at the beginning of this whole new way of life in the church. And the thing that is incredible for me, that I have to not compare myself to Father Marie-Eugene, because it's just impossible, is that he was doing all of this, founding an institute, teaching these courses, putting together these books, while he was also prior, while he eventually became a definitor in Rome, so one of the top in terms of the government of the whole order, visiting all these different Carmels in different
Throughout the
countries
world.
throughout the world, and then World War II breaks out. He has to go back to France and, very providential because then he can help Notre Dame de Vie grow and nurture it. But then he goes back to Rome and then he becomes the vicar general of the order. So like the vice president essentially. And the general passes away unexpectedly. He was a young guy, but he passes away on one of his visits to Mexico. And all of a sudden, Father Marie-Eugene is at the helm of the order. So he is the general, And it's just incredible what he was able to do. So he had such a gift for governance, and people trusted him, and they saw how capable he was. And yet at the same time, he was so spiritual, living, intense Carmelite life, contemplative life. At the same time, he was founding an institute, and
He was visiting all the French-speaking Carmelite nuns throughout the world also.
yes,
Which, as you know, those visitations are very intense and all-consuming. Yes.
And he had this unique mission from Pope Pius XII to form all of the Carmels in France into federations.
Yes.
Which was a new thing in the church before.
Very new. And he saw the wisdom. He thought, he that's also, again, something that I wish we could see we develop about him, aspects of him that haven't yet been studied. But you see how a concept that is very strange, even today, we see it with the cloistered sisters having, with the new things, core orants and all of those things. But something very new for monasteries that are supposed to be autonomous, to ask them to somehow live in a network, right? And it felt strange to him too at the beginning, but seeing the wisdom and always listening to, allowing himself to be stretched by the church.
Yes.
And he said, if I had to choose, which is a little impossible, because Carmel belongs to the church, but he said, if I had to choose between Carmel and the church, I would choose the church without hesitation. And we've seen how Carmelite he was. But of course, it's this distinction, it's impossible to separate.
The mother of
it's
Carmel
impossible.
Said, I am a daughter of the church.
So it's impossible. But you know what I mean
yes.
in terms of let's say if the government of the order tells you that, or the church, that's no doubt. And so that was something that he could say not easily. He was stretched by the church on several occasions. And he allowed himself to, and not just, he embraced the challenge, and he came out, really in favor, seeing what's beautiful about those federations. And he said, if they only served, even just served, to make us more aware of our charism and more aware of the needs of the world. You see, even for cloistered nuns, always the two. It's always for the world.
Yes.
So it would be worth it. But of course it was also, you can see how formation was so important to him. And so it was also for the sake of a better quality formation. They could pull together to have good teachers, good formators, the best, scholarship about. So it's much easier to do when you are as a network of monasteries. So he saw all of those things. But yeah,
and it's interesting that is still unfolding today.
It's still unfolding
this
today.
was under Pius XII, and yet here we are, still trying to do that because of that, the great good that comes out of it. And even though it's hard and it stretches you, and we need to learn that too. I think sometimes we can forget that the church and the magisterium really is meant to stretch us.
Yes,
because that's what we need. Because we don't want to get too narrowly focused. But anyway, not to go on. But and so then Father Marie-Eugene. One thing I'll just point out, maybe, as part of this closing. So he's involved with the nuns. He's very involved. Of course, his love for Therese has been with him all his life. He's preached so many retreats on Therese. He's developed his understanding of her. And he's so close to the Lisieux Carmel, And it's interesting that he is the one as Vicar General, as Vicar General, that he writes to Mother Agnes, the prioress of Lisieux. She was a lifetime prioress, is in the 50s now, or the 40s. And he says, it's time to release all of the manuscripts of Therese. It was good for that time, the way that it was edited, Story of a Soul, but now we need all the manuscripts. And that started the process to eventually get the edition of Story of a Soul that we have now. And that ICS Publications has the unique rights to have that translated into English. It's also been passed to other publishers who have contracted with us. And actually, I'll just mention one. Ascension Press has an edition of Story of a Soul that is the 3 original manuscripts that Father Marie-Eugene pushed for. And Anne-Elisabeth Giuliani, our co-host with us right now, was so kind as to write some of the reflections before each chapter. And I have to say, reading these helped me a lot, even though I've read Story of a Soul many times, and I feel like I understand it, but it gave me new insights into Story of a Soul, your reflections. So I just encourage people, just to know that, and to go for that. So it just, again, God used him in so many ways. And we'll hopefully have another episode or maybe a whole season about him and his spirituality. But for now, we just say, after being general for a while, and then a new general is elected, he goes back to France. He's working with Notre Dame de Vie, getting it, kind of consolidating it, bringing it to fruition. He's elected provincial. He's already sick at this point too,
Very
from
sick, yeah.
right all his missions, and he comes to this country too. It's neat. In our
1964.
Yes, and
That's
so he
the
was there, and it's really cool that some people met a saint in that way. And one of our friars remembers coming to our monastery at Holy Hill and giving the night blessing, the traditional night blessing, and so he's one of us. He's with us, and but all of his travels, he's exhausted, right? I mean, you think he's just given himself so completely, and he starts to feel the effects of that. They'd still elect him provincial, and even when it seems like he might not have any more time left, they elect him again provincial, and he says yes, right? And maybe you could just share, because he knew that he didn't have the strength, but he said, I've never turned down the Holy Spirit.
Yes.
The Holy Spirit is asking me this, right? I've never said no, and so he goes to the end, so faithful to the order, to everything that the church is asking him to. And
looking forward to the chapter of 67. He died just before. He thought he would have enough energy to participate. And he was saying, I've read something lately, I don't know where, that he was hoping that the ideas that had begun to mature at the chapter of 55 would finally come to fruition. So, he had to be so patient, because I think very often he would be ahead of his time, seeing the needs. But it took time. But in between, the council had happened. So, of course, eyes and hearts had been a little broken open about a few things. And yes.
Definitely. And
but he didn't see that.
Exactly.
He died in the 27th of March, 1967.
Yes.
Saying, now I go to the embrace of the Holy Spirit.
Right. Beautiful. And maybe we could close with just one thing about prayer. If you could just say, how does he define prayer, and how could that help us in our own struggles for an interior life?
Just that.
Yes, one little thing.
Just that little thing. Well, I think he would very often fall back to the definitions of Saint Teresa of Avila, this conversation with the one that we know that loves us, to the definitions of Therese, of the child Jesus, the movement of the heart, trust. I think that it is important to see that prayer, of course, there are these times dedicated to oraison, as we say, and to our time of in silent prayer daily. But these are not, for him, very clearly not an end in itself. They are to allow us, it's like the times in the desert, right, that we take, the retreats. These are times to allow us to readjust ourselves and to practice with, like the projectors we have now, right, but in order then to live it. There is it's a life of prayer. And everything becomes fuel for our prayer. Even though he describes, he's really in the school of John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila in really bringing light, insights, explanations on what is happening within the soul, between the person and the God who loves that person, he loved also to quote Thomas Aquinas, the God being the good self.
The
Communicating.
bonum diffusivum sui est.
Yes, yes. In that sense,
the good diffuses of itself.
Yes, self-communicating,
yes.
self-giving all the time. And so for him, prayer is tapping into that source, is making oneself available. And so, yes, there is a style, a Carmelite style of doing this. But it has to take the whole life. The point is not to do, my little time and then...
Yes.
Yes.
And now I'm done. It's like
now
I did
this
time of communion with God.
Yes.
Now,
Yes.
And it's the whole thing of contemplation and action being together. It's not that one leads to another per se. It's that it's all one reality. And like you said, those are training grounds so that you can live your whole life this way. You think of Brother Lawrence practice the presence of God, right? It's like the culmination of that.
And of course, for him, prayer is about love, and this exchange of love, exchanges of love. But we get through it thanks to faith. For him, the teaching on faith, which echoes, of course, John of the Cross, is so important in his approach to prayer and again to the life in the Spirit, our baptized life.
I can say that was
the
probably
role of faith is so,
Exactly, and it helps. It's so helpful because it's simple and it's something we all have, and it makes it so prayer is not this impossible or just for the elite or just, good prayers just if you're special. So many people say, well, I have ADHD or I have this struggle or maybe I'm autistic and it's like, yes, you have the gift because you have faith, and your mind might be distracted or you might think, differently in certain things, but it's the gift of faith that makes good prayer. And that's helped me so much that it's contact with God through faith and just trying to stay in that.
And when we say faith, it's not, believing in the creed. I mean, it's really, when he mentioned faith, he talks about the theological virtue of faith.
It's an exercise of this power that you have to he says to actually touch the fire that is God, and you can't, when you touch that fire, you will always draw some down, even if you feel dry and sleepy and poor. You can't help but be affected by it. And so it's just, it gives us courage that as long as we can just make an act of faith, and try our best to stay in that or keep coming back to that, and we are making good prayer. Yes. According to, that's how I see Blessed Marie-Eugene, how he's helped me a lot in my own prayer.
Thank you. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Anne-Elisabeth. This has been a great episode, I think, and a great pleasure to be able to hear your experience of Blessed Marie-Eugene and really as one of his privileged daughters. So I thank you for this time.
Thank you, Father Michael Joseph.